So this is going to be the second video on how to level up your language learning. If you've not yet watched the first video, which is all about how you can make language learning into a video game, or you can learn a language as though you're playing a video game, then I would highly suggest going back and watching that, as I'll be referencing that, and it's probably going to make a lot more sense if you've already watched that video. So this video is going to be all about sort of your training methods. I mentioned in the first video that learning a language is sort of like training a skill in video game. There are different skills that you can train depending on what sort of aspects that you're interested in learning within a language, and thus you'll have different methods of working on them, because reading a book isn't necessarily going to make it super easy for you to speak if you've never tried to speak before, and you probably won't be able to follow a conversation if you haven't actually heard how the language sounds when it's spoken. It's all about your methods for improving those different aspects that you're choosing to focus on. When studying, there will always be this sort of optimal thing that you can do, this thing that would help you and benefit you the most when learning a language. For instance, there are times when it would be really beneficial for me to use like 20 minutes and sit down and learn a specific grammar rule. But then what I often end up doing is I end up sitting and reading for about 5 hours instead of doing that. True, I'll probably have learned at least a little bit about that grammar rule, but it took me 5 hours. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's just something that you need to consider. So it's about how you can figure out which one you actually want to deal with. So the first benefit to doing this, and yes, there are benefits to sitting down and reading for 5 hours instead of spending 20 minutes studying a grammar rule. The first benefit is that you actually enjoy it. So remember I talked about how this is all about making your language learning into a video game, or learning as though you're playing a video game. So in video games, at least these massive video games with choices, you'll find people playing them that, for instance, want to go for an endgame boss really early and sort of try to do it with the minimum equipment and such. That is one way of doing it. Like, it's super motivating for them actually being able to do it with a really low base. For instance, I would be super happy if I could start reading Lord of the Rings week 1, for instance. I didn't do that when I was starting to learn Portuguese, but I would have been super proud if I finished Lord of the Rings basically by doing almost nothing else in terms of studying, and I was still able to understand what was going on in books. I would have been super happy with that. And thus, like, going for these things are so motivating that you're way more likely to actually want to keep on studying. Or in the sense of a video game, you're way more likely to want to keep on playing because it's a challenge, and most people enjoy being challenged. So the second benefit is that, so let's say that you actually decided to go ahead and watch a TV show for a couple of hours instead. Well, you'll probably end up learning the grammar aspect, at least to some extent. But what you also do is you pick up several words, probably another grammar aspect, you start learning a bit about that, and you'll have all these other benefits. As a quick side note, if you're finding these tips useful, or you're interested in seeing how I'm doing with my Portuguese, then yeah, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. It actually helps, and it makes it a lot more motivating for me to keep on making these videos. And I know at least some of you either want tips or really enjoy sort of seeing my progress in terms of my Portuguese. And I'll definitely be making more videos on that. So another thing that might be useful to consider is the fact that you could be doing something that is optimal at one point. So let's say that I was reading a book where I was able to understand like 80% of what I was reading, or I was watching a series where I was able to understand 80% of the conversation. I would be picking up a lot of new words just due to me understanding them from context. So if I know that they're talking about a certain thing, then I would be able to pick up words related to that thing, right? So let's say that would be the most optimal time to start watching or start reading either a book or watching a show where you're able to understand that much. But you don't actually have to start doing it at that point, and you don't have to stop doing it once you pass that point. Here's what I mean. You could start reading books super early. You probably wouldn't have the same benefit. You wouldn't benefit as much and the progress would be way slower. But you would be able to benefit a little bit and you would eventually reach that point where it becomes optimal. That is one way of doing it. And let's say that you're able to do that and keep motivated and you stick through it until you reach that point where it becomes optimal, and then you continue it. You continue so far that at this point you're able to understand 90 or 95% of what's being said or written, right? At that point it becomes less optimal because it's not as challenging as before. But you're still going to be picking up at least a few phrases, at least a few words every once in a while. So you're still going to be learning a little bit and you're still going to be getting those benefits, but isn't going to be as optimal. That still doesn't mean that you actually have to stop doing it. You don't have to stop studying simply because it's not optimal. You can continue, and especially if you enjoy it, that's actually a good way of doing it. Yeah, you can continue doing tasks or training methods in a game as well after they stop being super efficient. It's just a matter of actually finding something that you enjoy and that you can stick with. So at this point, it might sound like there is no benefit in doing the optimal thing instead of doing something that you actually enjoy. But let's say that you, for instance, enjoy watching series and you want to watch your favorite series in your target language. For instance, you're learning English, you want to rewatch your favorite series in English. But unless you actually enjoy watching it and not being able to understand the whole lot, then you might want to actually work through a period where you're specifically working towards being able to understand enough before starting it. So what I mean is, for instance, you could start by making a list of useful words and you can get some basic listening practice. That is one way of sort of preparing yourself for using that study method. So that is one way of doing it. And you don't actually have to do that for a long period of time. These methods of making a list of keywords and getting some basic listening practice, it might not be that exciting, but just the prospect of being able to eventually move on to what you actually want to do might make it motivating enough for you to be able to go through with it for the short period of time that you actually have to go through with it. So that is the one and only point in time where I would actually worry about what is the most optimal thing. As a final point, it doesn't really matter if something is optimal, or finding the thing that is optimal is never going to be more important than just sitting down and studying. Like, you're always going to benefit from that, and doing something that is less efficient is always going to be basically more efficient than doing nothing, because you're coming up with excuses about how you don't know what you're supposed to be doing. Doing something where you're getting input in your target language is always going to be beneficial. So stop wasting time focusing on trying to find the most optimal method and just sit down and study. Now, as always, best of luck with your studies and neck out.